Okay, well, nice to see you all. Happy Thursday. I've had the pleasure of working with Catherine for probably coming up for a year and a half now. And as Catherine knows, I'm a very passionate Bitcoiner, so I've run a Bitcoin community for women. And I recently gave a talk at Catherine's invite to the Rotary Club in Calgary. So she asked me to give the same talk to AG members, which is actually quite appropriate because the economy is basically what greases all of the trade that goes on in the whole world. And obviously, the Alberta Enterprise Group being such a key organization for business in Alberta, the conversation around our monetary system is quite relevant. But the specific focus of this really for me, sorry, did somebody off mute? The specific focus for me really is more around how it enables freedom. So the monetary system can be very difficult for people across the globe, and Bitcoin is a fantastic tool for enabling and liberating, I guess, people from a financial and a trade perspective. So I'm just going to share my screen and kick off the presentation. Let's see. So if we go to slideshow, present to view, there we go. Okay. So a bit oddly, but I'm going to kick off by asking what is money or exploring what is money. And this might seem like a very obvious question to people who use money every day, but I worked in finance for 20 years and I didn't really understand what money was until I started studying Bitcoin. So I always start off with this because I think it's pretty relevant. Um, oh, why is it not moving forward? There we go. We used to be on what was called the gold standard, and there are some politicians actually I discovered that still think we're on the gold standard. We're not. But what that meant was that we had money that was basically backed by gold, and it would usually sit in a repository somewhere. And you would be issued with what looked like an IOU, so paper IOU that said you've got this money or this commodity, gold, in a vault somewhere, and you can use this piece of paper to trade in that gold without actually having to swap the physical gold. We came off the gold standard officially really in 1971, so that's when Richard Nixon took the US dollar off of the gold standard officially, and because that was the world's reserve currency, the entire world effectively moved on to what's now called a fiat standard or what's called a fiat standard. And that just means let it be done in Latin, and it's money by decree. And the way that money by decree that is not backed by any commodity is enforced is through violence, which might sound like a very strong statement to make. But if you really take this out to this logical conclusion, if you don't pay your taxes in Canadian dollars, then you will find yourself in a cage at some point. And so that's the way that the use of fiat currencies around the world is enforced. Governments and their central banks issue them, and you are obliged to transact in the economy using that particular type of money. But what's the issue about fiat money? The issue with fiat money is because it's not tied to a commodity, there is no limit on the amount of fiat money you can issue. And the temptation to just keep printing money, effectively counterfeiting it, unfortunately has proved just too tempting for governments across the entire world. So I use the US dollar as an example because it's the world's reserve currency, just about still. But this applies to any fiat currency. Basically, governments want to print the money, and this is what the effect is. So you can see here in 1913 was when the Federal Reserve was established in the US, which, by the way, is neither federal, it's a private company, nor does it have any reserves. But since they started printing the US dollar, its value has lost about 96% over the course of a century in terms of purchasing power. So that means basically you can buy about 96% less with the US dollar now than you could back in 1913. So what is the purpose of money really? It gives you information. So it's a source of information. It allows you to store value. So if you work, you don't necessarily want to expend the fruit of your labor immediately. So let's say you're farming, you may not want to eat all the food that you've farmed in a day. So you sell it, you keep the money, and then you can store that energy that you've expended across space and time. It's a unit of account, so it allows you to measure things. And most commonly, how we know it, it's a medium of exchange. So we think of it as something that we use to transact with each other. The alternative being you'd have to barter and, swap a cow for a sheep or something like that. What we don't often consider is that it's a system of control. So if you have the ability to issue money and enforce its use, it gives you an immense amount of control over the economy and the human beings that operate within that economy, the borders of that economy. So why does any of it matter for Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is an innovation that has changed this whole paradigm. And in the words of actually the pseudonymous person or anonymous person that released the Bitcoin code back in 2008, it was explicitly to address this problem of the banking system. There was actually an inscription in the first block that was mined that states, January 3rd, 2009, which is when the first Bitcoin was mined. The British central bank, I think it says Chancellor, engages in quantitative easing or something like that. So basically that there's an inscription stating why this code has been released to the world. And Bitcoin's release to the world is comparable to the wheel, the printing press and fire. It's that big of an impact on humanity. And it may not be apparent to people, particularly in wealthy industrialized countries, but what this has done for the economic paradigm is revolutionary. So 31st of October 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto, who was either one person or a group of people, published a white paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And what was so special about this? So what Bitcoin solves for primarily is the fact that you don't need a central counterparty to validate transactions for you. The way that we operate currently is you go to a bank, you give them all your paperwork, your driver's license, and they allow you to transact with other people who have also gone and done the same thing. So there is a barrier to entry into the economic system. If you want a credit card, the credit card company needs to know who you are, the bank needs to know who you are. And this trust gets abused on a regular basis through money laundering, through the debasement of the currencies. And Bitcoin solves for this because it's a decentralized network that allows anybody to join, and there is no central counterparty needed to verify transactions. And it does this through a process called proof of work. So if you expend compute power, you get the ability to participate in a lottery. If you guess the lottery number correctly, you get the right to write a series of transactions that are waiting in the queue into the next digital ledger on the block. Once you've done that as a miner, you broadcast that transaction to about 50,000 nodes globally, and those nodes will check that you didn't cheat. So they'll check that you did actually participate in the lottery correctly. They'll check that you wrote the transactions correctly. And if they're happy with how you've done it, they'll validate the transaction, and that gets written immutably to the blockchain. And what that does is it just removes the need for a central counterparty. But the thing that's most important from our perspective in terms of human rights is that anybody can join this system. So all you need is an internet connection. And this just completely changes the paradigm of banking and all of the legislation that goes with that, the regulatory legislation like Know Your Customer, anti-money laundering, and all the rest of it. You just need an internet connection. You need to agree to the rules of participation, and then you can either mine or just transact on that network. If you mine and you try to cheat, your transaction will be rejected, and then you will have expended an immense amount of compute power, basically to end up with nothing. If you play by the rules, then the network's code automatically gives you some Bitcoin for the compute that you've expended and the transactions that you've written to the chain. So by code, it's basically rules without rulers. The code enforces good behavior. And this is massive for the unbanked. So about 1.4 billion, this was a World Bank estimate, was that there are about 1.4 billion people in the world are unbanked, and most of those are women. Some examples: in Saudi Arabia, women need men's approval to open a bank or a guardian. Women in Afghanistan can't have a bank account. Pakistan, about 82% of women do not have bank accounts. And Yemen as well, same, male permission is required to open a bank. And we kind of think of ourselves in the West as like, well, we have a banking system. It's fine. What's the problem? But you can see this journey. I kind of love this visualization of how legislation has been introduced over the centuries. So from the 1100s in the UK, when we had this concept of common law called coverture, which was where a woman's finances were subsumed into her husband's when she got married, all the way through to 1982, where actually women were finally allowed to go into a pub and legally buy a drink themselves without having to get a man to do it. We've had quite the journey, as you can see, in terms of the rights that have been granted to women throughout the world. And in the West, this is kind of the state of play, but as I've shown in much of the world, that's not the case to this day. In Canada, a woman wasn't even considered a person in her own right until 1929. So, how does Bitcoin operate as a tool for freedom? Well, here are some real world examples that I'd like to share. So, the big innovation about Bitcoin in terms of freedom is that it enforces cryptographically property rights. So, how does it do that? Bitcoin has a public key, which, if you think of it like your home address, it's publicly known. It's not necessarily tied to your identity, but that address is visible publicly to everybody, and everybody can see the Bitcoin that's contained therein. Your private key is like the key to your house. So you don't share that with anybody, but it's the way that you're able to move the Bitcoin across the network. The private key can be put into a series of words that's called a seed phrase, so either 12 or 24 words. And if you put them into an app or into a browser system that supports that in the correct order, you can reconstitute your private key and access your Bitcoin. So think about what that means. You can actually memorize those 12 words. I wouldn't recommend doing that as a storage, but in an emergency, you could memorize those 12 words and you could cross a border with nothing on you and you could take all of your wealth inside your head. So some applications of this might be if you're in a domestic abuse situation where you can't store money easily, this gives you an opportunity to store money either in your head or in some other way privately where it's not retrievable. Some of you will remember in Iran, when women were refusing to wear the hijab, the Iranian government was freezing their bank accounts, and they were able to use Bitcoin to circumvent these banking restrictions and censorship. Jewish Holocaust, I've thought about this a lot since I learned about Bitcoin. You know, many Jews didn't leave the country as soon as they should have done, if at all, because they had all of their home and their wealth stored in Germany or any of the countries that Germany had invaded at the time. Imagine if they could have taken their wealth in their head, how many more people would have been able to exit in good time. Closer to home, Canadian truckers. So people who donated to the trucker protest and people who participated had their bank accounts frozen by the Canadian government. So this was subsequently declared illegal, but at the time you had like single mothers who couldn't pay their rent or buy groceries. And actually Bitcoiners were able to deliver funds to the Canadian truckers using Bitcoin at the time when all of this happened. Afghanistan, so Roya Mahbub is a very well-known Afghani CEO. So she's apparently the first female tech founder in Afghanistan. And she paid her employees in Bitcoin. And actually, one of her employees who was in a dangerous situation was able to leave the country with all of her wealth because she was receiving her salary in Bitcoin. But as you can probably imagine, central banks are not very happy about this because if you have access to print money, you don't want some pesky code that's been released on the internet to take this away from you. So for people who are not familiar with this dude, his name is Augustin Karsten. He is the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements, which is the daddy of central banks. So all central banks roll into the BIS. And this is a statement that he made not too long ago. He said, in cash, we don't know who is using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a thousand peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC, which is a central bank digital currency, is that the central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also we will have the technology to enforce that. So what does he mean? A central bank digital currency is basically fiat currency, but it's controlled by the central bank. And they can issue it, they can freeze it, they can do whatever they want with it. And it's often positioned as something that will bank the unbanked. And this is an absolute lie because it has all the barriers to entry that regular fiat currencies and the regular fiat banking system has. The only difference is that governments and central banks don't need to go through the commercial and retail banks to freeze your account. They can just do it at a touch of a button. They can also prevent you from buying things that they don't want you to buy, filling your car with gas, and so on. And people think this is kind of like a dystopian fantasy, but it's actually already live in China, where if you cross a street, jaywalk, facial recognition will see who you are and immediately debit the fine from your bank account. If they don't want you to buy certain things, they can prevent you from doing that. And they can also completely remove any of your savings from the bank directly. And in China, this is tied to a social credit system. So if you do things the government doesn't like, you will quickly find yourself in a financial digital prison. And we see a disturbing trend in Europe where we see lots of politicians who were looking like they either won their elections or were looking like they were going to win their elections. And, the politics of that region perhaps didn't like the person that the people had chosen. And so we see this kind of trend where, democratically elected governments are being prosecuted. Christine Lagarde, who is actually a convicted criminal but now heads up the ECB, she has stated that they're going to be rolling out a central bank digital currency in October this year. So she never went to prison for her crimes, but she is a convicted criminal of fraud, if I remember correctly. So that probably tells you much of what you need to know. And this is a graph that shows all of the countries that are either doing a proof of concept of a CBDC or have rolled it out in some capacity already. So the sort of purple, pinky color, sorry, here is launched. So I think this was Nigeria. They launched it and had mass protests, but they're still trying. So this brings us back to this concept of money as a system of control. So how do you exit that? So this graph on the left here shows essentially what happened during the Weimar Republic. So when the German mark was crashing, people were trying to exit that system and going into gold. But today we have this amazing digital alternative that doesn't require you carrying anything on your person. You can cryptographically protect that money in your head if you so wish. And this quote is from Andreas Antonopoulos in the middle. He's a really well-known Bitcoin educator, fantastic follow if you want to go and watch his videos on YouTube. He says, Bitcoin is a global economy that is open to anyone of any race, religion, creed, ethnicity, and age anywhere in the world. And for most people, this concept hasn't quite sunk in yet. And I also like to think that Bitcoin isn't just a technology, it's a spiritual nudge and a silent invitation to exit the illusion and enter realignment. So currency affects everything that we do. And by using a currency that is effectively unethical, fiat currency, it has massive implications for society. But we have this amazing option now to start exiting it and moving to something that has a more ethical foundation. So with that, I will wrap up. I bashed through that as quickly as I could. I hope that's okay to meet time. But to open it up for any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Krista. If everybody can put up their hand if they have any questions. No questions?
No questions. Made it easy for me. Well, if you have any questions, you're very welcome to email me afterwards. I know that sometimes people are a bit shy, so just email me at krista@albertaenterprisegroup.com. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that anyone has. I will also say that I know that in Alberta we have, there's a bank called Bow Valley Credit Union. So their CEO is actually a Bitcoiner. And I know that some people on the call are familiar with them. But if you do want to bank with an organization that has a foot in that world, they're one that's very close to home that, businesses in Alberta might have sort of easy access to. So I would strongly recommend that you look into that. There's also a company that's based out of Edmonton called the Bitcoin Well. So they have Bitcoin ATMs all across the country, but they also have you can basically, as a company, as a corporation, you can buy Bitcoin through them if you want to store it on your treasury. And also as an individual, you can set up an account. Or if you prefer to protect your identity, you can actually just buy Bitcoin from their ATMs with cash, I think up to $995 or something at any one time. So I would strongly recommend that option if you're stacking Bitcoin as an individual, because you want to put as many protections as you can around your identity and its connection to the public address. So that would be my recommendation. Kathy, you have a question?
I do. Sorry, I missed part of your presentation, so you might have answered this, but a concern that I have is there is no rules or no central oversight of Bitcoin at all. It's just freewheeling, which not sorry, I'm waffling. My question is, what is to stop this system from being used for money laundering and for nefarious activities rather than for good activities? What's in place to stop that from happening?
The short answer is nothing. I mean, if you think about it, if you have a car, you can use the car to rob a bank or you can use it to drive your kids to school. So it's really just a tool. There's nothing inherently that stops you from doing that. But I will say that the Bitcoin network is a very, very poor medium to money launder because it's a public ledger. So anybody can see any transaction that's happened across the Bitcoin network. What they don't necessarily know is who that public address is tied to. But if that public address ever becomes associated with an individual or a company, you can trace exactly what transaction they've made. So overwhelmingly, criminals prefer to operate in fiat because they can hide their activities in a way that they can't on the blockchain. So I would, if anyone's thinking of committing a crime with Bitcoin, I would strongly recommend that you choose another medium to do that.
Oh, fine, I'll put my plans on hold then.
Funny,
Thank
funny.
you. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions for Krista? Okay, well, Krista, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your
Thank you.
contribution today and to always for AG and all the things you do. Thank you.
Thank you.